Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. For today's episode, we're joined by Michael Patrick Lynch, who is the author of the new book, On Truth and Politics, Why Democracy Demands It, which is available for pre-sale from Princeton University Press. He's also the Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor of Philosophy and the Provost Professor of Humanities at the University of Connecticut, and the author of other books like Know-It-All Society and The Internet of Us. You'll find links to those books in the show notes. We had a great discussion on a wide range of topics, mostly focusing on how scientists can effectively communicate truth to a variety of audiences in our current political and technological context. So with no further ado, let's go to the interview. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, I thought we might get started with a little bit of a discussion of the backdrop in front of which this conversation takes place. So thinking about things like truth and common reality and the technology and, where we stand with that sort of thing today. Can you give us a little bit of an idea of, what things are like right now?
I think we're living at a particular moment, both with not just politically, but culturally, socially, and technologically, where the idea that we're living in a common reality is actually open for discussion.
Right.
I mean, let's just start with that. The idea that, that there is a world out there that's larger than us, that isn't just a product of our biases and convictions and prejudices, is something that seems to be under attack in a variety of ways, often not directly. I mean, right. Lots of people who are interested in pushing their own agendas, both with regard to science and things outside of science, are happy to do so flying the banner of truth and evidence. And we'll be talking about this. And certainly will say, well, I am a defender of the ideas of facts and reality, even when they're going out of their way to undermine people's commitments to evidence, facts, and a notion of common reality. But I think one of the things that, I think all of us listening to this will hopefully agree is that it is absolutely crucial, especially when it comes to the climate emergency, to realize that we are living in a common reality. And that while we might have different views on that reality is there, and it will kick back at us if we don't quickly acknowledge that our overlapping views actually are views of a world independent of us.
And, are some methods better than others for sort of discerning what that underlying common reality is? I think we'll find a bias within our audience, and I think it's largely a correct one, that, the scientific method is a good way of knowing. What are your thoughts on that?
I've been a long-time defender of the idea that science is not just important as a means, obviously, for detecting what's true about the world, but thinking scientifically is actually a core democratic value. It is not a coincidence that the sorts of thinking that we associate with science and the sorts of political arrangements like democracy have sometimes been found right in the same text by the same authors in, let's say, the period of the 17th and 18th centuries. I'm thinking here of people like John Locke, for example.
Right.
So thinking scientifically is something that democracies have a special interest in promoting in their citizens. And that part of that reason is because democracies need an informed citizenry in order for their citizens to actually participate in the process of deciding what we ought to collectively do in the face of shared problems given to us by our common reality. Of course, thinking, empirically, that is, doing the sort of empirical science that many of the people listening to this are engaged in, is only one way of thinking scientifically. We'll all agree that mathematicians, right, mathematical thought, no matter how abstract, is a core component of thinking scientifically in the broader sense. And thinking clearly and logically, whether you're a philosopher or you're a humanist of another stripe, is again, something that we can all agree on is part of thinking scientifically in the wide sense. And then finally, I think another discipline that is incredibly important with relation to your question is history. Right now, it's a surprise to no one, I hope, that just as science and in many areas of our life is under attack by disinformation and misinformation, history has long been under attack in that same way. So the discipline of history and archival research and the sort of fine-grained research that historians do is equally important to our democratic way of life.
Absolutely. And I'm curious now about the phenomenon that we see so often of, those who are ostensibly making scientific arguments, but they're not really doing so from the basis of scientific consensus. That is, they're deploying scientific sorts of language, but they're not really making an argument that reflects what the actual evidence is. I was just curious to get your thoughts on that phenomenon.
Yeah, that's a familiar part of the science denier's playbook,
Sure.
is to actually wave, as I was saying before, those who attack democracy often wave the banner of democracy. Those that attack scientific consensus typically wave the banner of science, and do so quite vigorously, claiming that they are the ones, in fact, that are most attuned to the facts and evidence. This is, something that we have seen throughout, starting well over 100 years ago with attacks on evolutionary theory. With now, of course, the latest examples are attacks on vaccine science and the science related to climate change, and many other examples that we may give. I think this is of enormous frustration, of course, to those of us who are down in the trenches of actual research. But it's really, I think, crucial to understand that that one of the reason that these particular misinformation and disinformation peddlers are successful isn't necessarily to do with obviously with the research they are actually putting forth in front of people. People who are listening to influencers on TikTok about climate change, for example, are often responding not to the information that is being given, although sometimes they obviously are, but they're actually often tuning in because of a sort of different set of reasons, often having to do with the influencers. For example, in my case, influencers on TikTok, often having to do with how they're packaging their science out in relation to a set of identities.
Sure.
People often, and I think this is actually really crucial. So if I can I just sort of frame things in a certain way?
Please.
I think a lot of us, and I include myself in this, when we think about, science denial, let's just use that term in broad way, our typical reaction to it is, well, look, in order to get, past science denial and to try to, give people better information, we need to actually just give them more information. The truth will win out. We just need to get our message out there. And at the same time, we need to, make sure as much as we can to, point out the flaws in the people who are making these denials. And, of course, nowadays there's a recognition that just dumping facts on people, I think there's, as many of you, the listeners will know, there's a lot of research that simply dumping facts on people is not often the best way to change people's minds. So there's been an effort, properly so, to engage in inoculation. You think of misinformation and disinformation as toxic, and one way to try to fight a toxin is, or other influence of that sort, is to try to, do work ahead of time, to get people inoculated ahead of time to science denial. That's a great idea, and it has been, these efforts have been, to some extent, successful, depending on the topic and the country in question. But that typical strategy of either trying to give more information in advance or later, right? As I said, dumping facts on them later, right? That strategy actually needs to be complicated. It needs to be complicated because that strategy tends to assume that people are forming their beliefs based on what they perceive the evidence is or the facts are. And either strategy, the inoculation, the before or after strategy, right? They're both assuming that. And of course, many people do form their beliefs based on what they perceive to be the evidence. Yeah. That's obvious. But it's also the case that people form attachments to points of view, sometimes even when they're not believing them. Often people will commit to things like science denial, to denying climate change, for example, or denying the efficacy of vaccines. They'll commit to those viewpoints, even really independently of whether they believe them. Sometimes they'll believe them. Sometimes it's the commitment that the purveyor of the denial really desires. And I can explain what I mean by that. But first, let me mention another way in which I think in this conversation I want to complicate this typical strategy. The strategy not only assumes that people are going around believing science denial all the time, it also assumes, based on what they perceive the evidence is, it also assumes that their commitment or their belief is the product, as I said earlier, of their perceived perception of the evidence, when in fact, it's often a product of what we might call the political meaning they associate with things like vaccine and climate and climate change science and climate science. And not understanding these 2 points, failing to appreciate that it's the political meaning of our scientific claims and the fact that many people attach to views independently of their belief about them. Failing to appreciate these 2 points, I think, can really cause us to get off on the wrong foot when dealing with science denial. So I know that was a lot, so I'll take a sip of coffee.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So, people are adhering to, sets of beliefs somewhat on the basis of a political commitment, perhaps, or an identity-based relationship that they have with certain points of view, and they may not necessarily be, they didn't arrive at their beliefs through the interrogation of evidence. They've come by another pathway, and that has implications for then the way that we would hope to guide or inform them in other ways. What are those implications like?
Well, first, let's give an example of what we were talking about that is very simple and people may have heard about. In 2017, 2 political scientists, Schaffner and Lux, just up the road from me in UMass, published a study in which what they did is they interviewed groups of self-identified Trump supporters, self-identified Clinton supporters, and people who self-identified as supporting neither. Okay. And what they did, among other things, is they showed, in one case, these groups of people 2 pictures. One picture both pictures will be familiar to many in the audience. One was taken during the Trump inauguration and showed a certain amount of people on the mall, and another picture was taken during one of Obama's inaugurations and showed a number of people at the mall. One of the pictures happened to have a lot more people in it than the other.
Sure.
Now, what the researchers asked was not which inauguration was better attended. You can't determine that based on 2 pictures, right? Because you don't know when they were taken and anything like that. But these pictures were famous at the time in 2017, when they were running this study. They were much discussed in the news media. Everybody knew these pictures. And what they asked was simply, they asked people which picture has more people in it. That's all they asked. Which one has more people in it? And then a variant, which picture seems to have more people in it. And what they found is that self-identified Trump supporters were much more likely to say that the picture that had much less people in it had more people in it. Now, the striking difference between these pictures is hard to
yeah, I remember the
hard to overemphasize. I mean, it's clear to anyone which picture has more people in it, right? So the question the researchers were asking themselves was, well, what the heck's going on? I mean, to be fair, everybody, most people in all groups gave the correct answer. But a subset of the Trump supporters, much higher proportion than the other groups, said that what seemingly was obviously false. Right. Why would they do that? Well, one possibility, would be, well, those people just, there's something wrong with their mathematical abilities. That's very unlikely. What seems much more likely, as the researchers themselves said, is that, look, they are expressing their commitment to a candidate and to a viewpoint. They're not stating what they believe. It would be weird to think that they actually believe that. Maybe some of them did, because people can get themselves to believe all sorts of things. So the example what I'm trying to do with this example is to illustrate that the same sorts of thing happens with climate change, with vaccine denial, with COVID, right? We remember people denying that they had that their COVID was real, while widely documented and discussed in both scientific literature and journalism. People being interviewed while they're dying of COVID, saying that COVID doesn't exist. That happened during the pandemic. Why? Were they really believing that? Maybe some of them were. But a lot of them were expressing their identities and their commitments. We can commit to propositions without believing them, and we can believe things that we're not ready to commit to. For example, all of us here, I'm sure, believe that climate change is serious and we must all as individuals do things to help mitigate its effects. But you can find yourself sometimes not committed, that is, not willing to act on that belief as much as you would like. In the same way, you can commit to things that you don't believe. That's very common, and we were just talking about that. So why is underappreciating that phenomenon? So that's the two ideas that I've given here. One is that there's a difference between people committing and they're believing misinformation. And the second is that we'll talk about later is about political meaning. What you ask me is, well, how does that affect things? What that affects is that we need to understand that if people are really committing to certain parts of science denialism, certain claims like COVID isn't real or climate change is a hoax, if they're committing to those things without necessarily believing them, then that tells us that, really it's not the evidence that's the issue here. It's not the evidence. It's the political action that they see this commitment as allowing them to engage in. Just like someone might respond to, you can imagine being somebody who is interviewed by a pollster or interviewed by somebody they think of as a sort of pointy head intellectual elite scientist for a study, and not giving them what the answers they actually think might be true, because they're actually more interested in using these answers to commit or to display their commitment, to signal their commitment to a particular ideology. So the first lesson from that is that our common strategy we talked about above might be aiming at the wrong target. The question we have to ask is, how do you change people's commitments? Not just how do you change their belief? And to do that, I think, is to realize that we have to understand more accurately than maybe we even do now why people do commit to what they commit to. And that's the second part of the 2 points that I was making before. Why is it that people commit to what they commit to? So one answer to that is that they commit to things often because of that piece of information's political meaning.
Right.
So let me explain what I mean by that, if I can. So let's take a claim like climate change is a hoax. Climate change is a hoax literally semantically means, in the sense that somebody, a person who understands or studies semantics and linguistics, what does that mean? It means climate change is a hoax. That's what the person is saying when they say that. But the political, what I'm calling the political meaning, is not its real is not the sentence's semantic content. It's the set of associations, political associations, that sentence has in the person's mind. Thus, the sentence or a claim that climate change is a hoax means the same thing to you and me. It has a meaning in the English language. But our political meaning can change from person to person, from audience to audience. So that's why, and that political meaning is that set of political associations. And those associations include, like, what sort of values are associated with that claim? What sort of political stances do we take? If somebody says that in your presence, what do you infer about them? Right? What sort of actions do you think they're going to take inside the voting booth and without? And the same thing goes for somebody who says that climate change is real. If you're a climate scientist and you're testifying in front of Congress, and a senator says, raises the question absurdly whether climate change is real, and the scientist says, well, that's what the evidence says, you can imagine this happens, right? Where a scientist suddenly finds themselves, just because they say that's what the evidence says, a politician saying, well, you're politicizing it.
Right. You're politicizing it.
Why? And we get really frustrated. We're like, we're not politicizing it. It's not a political claim. Well, what I'm trying to say is actually everything can become politicized. Everything everything from the hats we wear to the cars we drive to the coffee we drink, and to obviously the things we say, can come to have these political associations in people's minds. They'll read into your political views based on all those things. Cars you drive, do you drink Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks? Do you drive a Prius or a pickup truck? Right? All those things can be read accurately or inaccurately by people, as we all know. But they are read, and we can't change that fact. Trying to pretend that our claims don't have these political resonances is just to ignore reality. So what I think that we need to understand more than we often do today is when dealing with the client with science denial, is that people are often committing these bits of denialism because of that stance's political meaning.
Right.
In other words, it signals an identity. It says, I'm going to commit to, I'm going to say COVID's not real either, because that's what my team is saying. And so I want to be seen as on the team. And in the same way, people read the claims of scientists politically, whether we like it or not.
Right.
We don't like it.
Of course not.
Right?
Yeah.
Who likes that? Right? Nobody likes that. But it happens. And so that means that, for all of us, like myself and yourself and many of the people who are listening, when we talk about our scientific results or talk about science in general, we've got to understand that it can be read, what we're saying can be read in a variety of political ways. And we cannot control how it's read completely, but we can be sensitive to it. And that, I think, is a key element of successful science communication in today's day and age.
So it comes down to this, an understanding of the fact that people's statements that we would believe to be science denialism are not necessarily a reflection of their interpretation of evidence in any way. It's simply a statement of their affiliation and their political commitments. They're lining up with their team, so to speak. What are the implications for scientists, who are communicating, let's say, with policymakers? Is it best to frame your science communication in such a way that it tries to sidestep those types of political affiliation triggers, or is it best to tackle it head on? What advice would you give to someone who is hoping to convey a scientific message with very high stakes to people who might be in positions of power? Is there a way around it in those moments?
Okay, that's a great question, and I think the right answer to this question is that there's no single answer that's appropriate for every bit of science communication, and we all know that, right? So we might as well just get that out front, right? I can't say here's the one magic magic bullet that'll help us explain our scientific results in high stakes situations to policy makers. Dan Kahn, researcher in Yale, has been advocating for a number of years, framing, right, for the reasons that I've been mentioning, partly, framing in some cases, particularly with regard to some discussions about climate change, framing can help in certain cases. There's as many of you know, listening, there's an open question whether what sort of labels we should be using. Climate change, I talked about the climate change emergency earlier. We don't really talk about global warming as much anymore, right? Because of that became politicized in a certain way. I mean, we do, but there's it's for reasons that have been connected to this. We talk now. There's the argument that goes on that in certain parts of the country, it's best to talk to stakeholders in terms of, which is sort of everyone now, but particularly, let's say, farmers, right? Let's take them as an example. That there's research by Kahn and others that may be talking about whether emergencies or extreme weather is a way of giving people permission to talk about climate change without talking about climate change.
Right.
So the reason I mention this is because that's one tactic that you mentioned. And I'm suggesting, yes, that in certain situations where you want not just, you asked me specifically about communicating to policyholders, but sometimes if a scientist is trotted out, for example, it sometimes happens, to talk to people in a community to try to get them to appreciate certain evidence about what's happening in their community, right? Sometimes then it can be helpful to try to meet people partly where they are and to realize that they really are interested in what you would call climate change, accurately. But they have a difficult time feeling like they can do that in public, right? So sometimes it's important to, I think, frame things in a way that, as I put it, gives people permission to talk about our common reality and allow you to still give the same evidence, but slightly frame it in a way that allows people to not necessarily feel like they aren't going to get in trouble with their team by talking to you about it, by even just talking to you, right, as a scientist. Now, when it comes to policyholders, I think, like, when we're actually talking to advocates, there's, again, this complicated, right? Are you talking to somebody are you talking to a Senate committee, right? Or a House committee, which is going to be composed of people on different sides and who are actively going to try to weaponize your claims for or against? Then I think I think you've got to recognize that whatever you say could be used and read into in certain ways that you will not approve of as the scientist. And therefore, I think sticking to how you would explain it, um, how you think is the most accurate language. Just use the language that you think is accurate. If everything's going to get politicized in the House committee, then sticking to the evidence and saying this is what I think is happening. This is what I think the evidence points that we should do if you're going to make that claim, a normative claim like that. Often you're not. You're just going to say this is what's happening, right? There is a pandemic, for example. Then I think just going in and doing the job and realizing that things will be spun, are inevitable, is the best you can do, and not beat yourself up about that. That being said, you can also, I think, and I've seen this happen both in my own case and other cases, that it can be effective to make sure that if you are speaking to a mixed group like that, that you make sure your advocates, the people that, like, let's say, invited you there, right, or that they, right, are ready to counter one reading of the political meaning of what you're claiming with another narrative. So understanding that there is going to be narratives that are built around your evidence, and to be ready to for your advocates and your allies to underline one particular narrative is, I think, crucial. I know I'm talking in fairly vague and abstract terms, but again, this is a big question,
right?
And I'm trying to give, as much as I can, a couple of different practical strategies, right? And we might summarize. In my opinion, when speaking to stakeholders who are not policy makers, maybe it is best to try to meet them in a place where they feel like they have permission to actually talk about the facts. And if you can't, right, you might not be able to do that. Speaking to policy makers, it may be in a mixed setting where there's people of a variety of different, like on a committee. It's best, I think, to just give the evidence, but be ready for the attempt to weaponize the narrative, and to be ready to push back against that in just those terms. And this gets to the last point you raised. Should you just go in, guns blazing, and realize that people are going to, try to twist sometimes that's the right way to go, right? Give the evidence, and then when folks try to co-opt that or to say that you're politicizing things, say, no, I am not. But I understand that other people are, and that's dangerous. I think it is important for scientists to be able to say, you're weaponizing information for a political purpose, and that is dangerous. As you said, especially when we're talking about stakes, high stakes, and we've all lived through, I've been mentioning the pandemic because, that was a case where sciences, biological sciences, medical science was under attack. And the stakes couldn't have been higher. And so I think it is important nowadays to realize it's happening and occasionally be ready to call it out.
That makes sense. Now, and I'm thinking about the incredibly high stakes we have right now. I would argue almost unprecedented for science communication. The last century's battle was, largely about the teaching of evolution, which is, of course, incredibly important. Yep. But right now we're dealing with, science communication that's happening in a real-time environment, as it were, on, topics like the climate emergency and the pandemic. And it has implications for, how sick people will get, or whether, they will face, certain, climate-related calamities and things like that. And I'm wondering about, in particular, given those stakes, the ways that scientists and others who are advocating for science might discuss the concept of uncertainty. Uncertainty is baked into science, in a sense. And, I wonder about your thoughts on how that should be communicated in this environment, in this political communication environment. Are we upfront about what we don't know about, or are we revealing a chink in our armor that could cause us to have our views compromised? How should scientists speak about uncertainty in a way that doesn't undermine their fundamental messages?
Terrific question, and a hard question. Again, it's the sort of question that is not going to be one size fits all, because we're talking about a lot of different kinds of science that have different types of evidence and different amounts of evidence for different claims. But that being said, I'm a big believer in the idea that we should be able to, and I think we can, be able to communicate to people our scientific results in ways that actually does respect the fact that you mentioned, that all empirical science is to some degree or other going to be less than perfect certainty. Empirical science is not mathematics. Mathematics, right? In almost all types of mathematics, I'm not talking about statistics. I'm talking about, number theory and geometry. These things do lead to a type of deductive proof, right? Where we can say, well, you might not understand the theorem, but it gives us certainty, right? And that's why we're going to design the space shuttle this way rather than that way, right? So look, putting mathematics aside, uncertainty, I think what we need to is something that humans live with and fear. And so the reason that people turn to experts is because they want some assurance. All of us do. All of us do. At the same time, humans, when reminded that life is uncertain, will all shake their heads. There's not a human on the planet, right? Even those who have committed to very ideological views, who won't, in much of their life, understand that things like decisions about parenting, right? What parent doesn't understand the practical role of uncertainty, right? Everybody who has made a parenting decision in their life ever has thought to themselves, well, I hope this works.
Right.
I hope this works.
Multiple times a day.
A couple times a day. So the reason I bring up that analogy is that I think it's really important when the communicating sciences to try to remind people that, okay, what we have here is the data points in this direction. We have more evidence for this claim than its denial. We have better evidence for this than we have for that. Notice that in each of those cases, I'm talking about not either or, but I'm talking about more or less. And, all of us in science, when we talk about results, are going to use variations of those sorts of phrases. But emphasizing that there can be, at the same time, as we also know with parenting and other things in our life, there may never be certainties about in parenting what's the best choice for your kid right now, today, this morning, with regard to that question that they're asking you. There are better and worse answers, right? We all know that there are some things, right? Like those are right out, like those are bad choices for a parent. And there's other things where we think like there's definitely that's much better. So, here's a question, for example, the scientific question is in part, when's the best time, if at all, to give your child access to a smartphone? Sort of thing, the parents around so that's, now there's going to be evidence that's going to point in one direction or another, let's hope. I think people will understand the role of uncertainty if we frame it the right way. If you remind people that this is, like if you're talking about in climate science or you're talking about vaccines are a good example. I've had people in my own family complain after they get a vaccine that, oh, they still got COVID, right? Right, which these are reasonably educated people, and you have to remind people, like, oh, okay, let's go back to basics now, right? And you don't have to say it that way, but the point is that people frequently do look for assurances where, given a moment's reflection, they will realize, oh yeah, of course, right? It's not a guarantee. It's not a guarantee that you're not going to get COVID. It may lessen the likelihood, or it may make your, and what's the point of the vaccine? Well, the point of the vaccine is generally to make sure that people don't die, they don't go to the hospital, to lessen symptoms. And that, so again, often, as I'm saying, I keep emphasizing, I really think this is important. When you're communicating science, go back to basics. Don't be afraid to try to say, to draw an analogy of some sort, to say, look, the evidence points to this. Oh, well, is that certain? No, we need more evidence to get, we're going to continue to collect evidence, but the preponderance of the evidence points in a particular direction. And then to remind people that, evidence comes in degrees. There's more or less of it. And like everything else in life, there isn't certainty here. But just like in life, you have to make decisions based on the evidence that you have in front of you and the amount that you have in front of you. That's what, in a particular case, a scientist or a physician is going to do. Your physician is going to recommend, hopefully, the path forward for a particular condition that seems the wisest given the amount of evidence they have at the time. And reminding the patient or the public that uncertainty is a part of life, that science is not going to be able to give us certainty about anything, but that's not a surprise for any human. Obviously, people have to use that sort of advice that I'm giving and put it through translate it through their own field, right? But the strategy, I hope, is clear enough.
That makes quite a bit of sense, and we've talked about communicating with policy, and I think also the general public to some degree. I'm interested also in how these phenomena that you've described that make communicating science a challenging endeavor correspond or relate to communicating science to younger people. So this could be a high school population, or perhaps a university or even a graduate student population. Are they less susceptible, more susceptible to some of these trends than other groups, or what are the implications for education as well?
Bunch of really cool questions there and hard ones, some of which I think are straight out empirical, and actually I will just say I don't know the answer to, because I'm not sure anybody knows the answer to. And the particular one I'm thinking about is the degree to which younger people, let's say 18 or 20 and under, are they more or less susceptible to science denial, misinformation, and disinformation? Do not know the answer to that. There may be people in the audience that feel like they do know the answer to that. That's cool. I'd love to hear about that. But I've seen there's, I think, conflicting information about that. That's a very difficult question. What we can say, though, is that when I think communicating to younger people brings with it certain advantages and certain perils for anybody talking science. The most obvious factor in both the advantages and the perils, the things that are the pros and the cons here is social media.
Sure.
When you're communicating to people 20 and under, we're talking about real digital natives. Back 10 years ago, we used to talk about digital natives as if they existed. I understand digital natives as people who have only lived in the time of smartphones, right? That people, or at least much of their sort of cognitive life that they have full or a lot of memory access to, right? It was lived in the time of smartphones. That includes, everybody in high school and and most of the kids in college now. And that means that their entire life has been shaped by a personalized information environment. And that's really crucial to keep in mind. Everything that we encounter online, as I'm sure all of us know and are aware of, everything we encounter online, from the links that come up on our Google searches to the information that comes down our social media feeds, including the news that comes down our social media feeds. All of that is personalized by the algorithms that run the economy of the internet to fit our perceived pre-existing preferences, to fit the trail of ones and zeros, as it were, that we've left with our smartphone and our digital devices on the internets. And that means that it's really nowadays and really much easier for us to figure out what we want to watch on Netflix, right? And it's great to have personalized information when trying to figure out what to watch on Netflix. It's not so great when you're shopping for facts, because when you end up only getting the facts, I'm putting air quotes up, that fit your personal preferences, that's a recipe not for bursting your information bubble, but expanding it, solidifying it. So that fact that we're talking about a population that has only existed in a time of personalized information is really crucial to understand when communicating about, let's say, politically sensitive science topics. Because that means that many of the kids that you're talking to, particularly if you're talking to a demographic that might have different, as I did recently, I was giving a talk in a high school last week, I think it was, and talking about this topic. And one of the things that became apparent is that not everybody in the room, was of the kids, they were seniors, were on the same page politically. And that's not surprising, and a good thing in a democracy. And we're not all supposed to agree. I mean, that's fine. But what also meant is that some of the examples that people were using of misinformation were not seen as misinformation by some members of the class. And so that is, and these things, and the sources of evidence that people were appealing to were things like TikTok, right? Which has, as some of your listeners may not know, is incredibly popular, and B, has the most effective algorithm for personalization in the world. Its algorithm is insanely effective at hooking the person up with things that they will find interesting. So what that means, I think, is that you have an opportunity there, as some people have been doing, to use social media to actually reach groups of people. You can exploit that personalization. And we all know, and some of listeners may actually be part of organizations that are using social media to try to get their own information, accurate information, to a certain group of certain demographic. That's the advantage. The disadvantage is that you can unwittingly walk into something that is polarized on TikTok that you didn't realize was polarized, because you're, let's say, like me, of an age where spending time on TikTok sounds like, torturing yourself or something, right? But I have a daughter who's just starting college. And so, when I want to know what's going on in TikTok, I ask her, right? And and I did after that discussion with these high school students, because I was like, is there something going on about TikTok about a particular issue? And she was like, yes, there is. So, I think in that sense, the best advice I can give you to worry about is just to be aware that the personalization is reached at a sort of incredible apex. And when communicating with younger people, be aware that their sources of information will have that feature. on the other hand, they're all aware of the personalization. Like,
Sure.
I mean, it used to be when I first started talking about this stuff, that is misinformation in the internet years ago. I remember in, let's say, 2015, 2014, giving talks to public audiences where I would say, people, your Google searches are even personalized, right? Like, you won't necessarily all get the same links at the top. And people not believing me in the audience, actually challenging me. And so I got used to just doing it, having everybody pull out their phones, right? Or computers, and actually doing the Google search, right? And then we would compare notes. And, sometimes it depends on what you Google. It's complicated, I think you all know. Of course, the algorithm is proprietary and changes. But the point is that people weren't believing, even also they didn't believe that Facebook was so personalized. But nowadays, almost everybody understands that. Not everybody. A lot of older people still don't, but younger people definitely do. And the most savvy of the younger people actually spend time trying to fake out the algorithm. As many of you may know, that's a sort of game you can play, which is that you engage in you game it. You game the algorithm on a platform by deliberately searching for things that are opposed to your view, or things that you're not actually interested in buying, things like that, right? And then do a lot of that. Now, I don't research on this myself, and I don't engage in gaming very much anymore. But I have been told by teenage authorities that it's actually really hard to do on platforms like TikTok now, and that it's less effective. That it's difficult to outgame the algorithms anymore. But my point there is, kids are aware of this. They are aware of the personalized environment they're living through, mostly, and they're willing to. So if you, they're aware that misinformation spreads. They might have their differences about what misinformation is, but you can reach them by sort of reminding them that, oh yeah, this happens, on TikTok and Instagram and Snapchat, which is, of course, nobody young ever would be caught dead on Facebook.
Of course not. No. No, and that's a great point. And I think, my daughter would certainly be a reflection of that. She knows how the algorithm works. And she would certainly not let me play any of my music on her Spotify account. That would not be, I couldn't get away with that one. But a question about, these sort of social media informational bubbles and scientists engaging with them. First of all, is it wise for scientists to even be engaged in this sort of stuff at all? Is it good to be on those platforms? And second, and perhaps more important, is if you were going to do it, is there a way, or in theory, a possibility of using those platforms in a way that's likely to avoid the phenomenon that I always worry about, which is that, we're communicating science, and we're communicating science to people who already like science and already agree with us on, all of the primary principles. And rather than, changing minds, or at least exposing people to information that might allow them to change their minds, we're simply, we're preaching to the choir, as it were. We're just, reaching an audience that we've already won over. Is there a way to do that might work better than others?
I think that when you engage with social media, it is best to be deliberate and understand what your goals are. Let's start with the last part of your point. I think actually it's a perfectly fine goal to communicate to those who already agree with you if what you're doing is doing what we're trying to do here, which is to strategize about how best to communicate in general. That is actually super useful, and it's something that's done by the denialists themselves, amongst themselves, right? So strategizing about and workshopping things to each other can be helpful. But you've got to be deliberate in the sense that you need to know that anything you do on social media is also open for being read with particular political meaning. So one of the things I think I would definitely be careful of is I think people can fall in the temptation of wanting, especially on the platform formerly known as Twitter. As we all know, that was a platform that all platforms do this, but Twitter was particularly known for and still is X, for hair trigger reactions that would and emotionally laden social media fistfights between scientists and I'm sure everybody has examples of scientists who have fallen wittingly or unwittingly into these sort of debates. Now, I mean, certain people do this deliberately. They go after science denialists or politicians and, say scientist here, right, for example, or historian here, and they are very deliberate in actually, going on the offensive, right? But if it's deliberate, that's one thing. Then you know that you're going to get pushback. You know that what you say is going to be politicized even more than you're already doing. But I'd be careful, because I think that unless you sort of are willing to, do that sort of political work, and that's essentially what you're doing, you can find yourself building a social media profile that becomes unwittingly a part of certain politicized fights. So when you are, talking about science on social media, ask yourself why you're doing that. What is your goal here? Is it to get the information out about your study? You just got a piece published in Nature, so you want people to read the piece. I mean, if it's in Nature, people are going to read it anyway. But I mean, you see my point, right? Is that I mean, we're all proud of if we have a study with some interesting results in it and it's published, we want to put that out there. Our universities want to promote it. Okay, if that's what we're doing, is we're promoting this to try to get the word out about some important new result, great. That's great. If it is going to be politically sensitive, be ready, as many of you already are when you publish, be ready that if you do that, that's going to be shared and retweeted by people who may not have the same agenda. They may be allies, but they may be the sort of ally that wants to, use this work to promote a view that you might agree with, right? And to do so more aggressively. That might be great, but be ready for that to happen, and be ready to think about how you're going to respond or not. The other thing I would say is, if you're not willing to sort of, if you haven't thought through these implications about what this can do to your life, and people who are engaged in climate scientists in particular right now, really aware of this, right? I mean, attention from the wrong sort of denialist can really screw up your practical life, actually. So you need to be able to say to yourself, well, is this, in this particular case, worth it, right? Is it worth it for that possibly to happen? Now, for most of us, that's never going to happen, right? For most of us, the sorts of work we do is not going to be politically sensitive enough that it's going to be spread by people on X, or attacked by Elon Musk. But for those who, and you know who you are, you already know that you need to be deliberate in your social media. That's the biggest advice I can give you. You need to be deliberate. You need to know what your goal is. And that can also, the second piece of advice is, just like with emails, it's best not to send an email that you write in anger ever right after you write it. I mean, we all know that, right? Don't do that. You're pissed off about something, you write an email, that's not the right time to send it. Think about it. The same thing sometimes with social media. Those who are people who are, some of you who have large social media followings, you are doing probably that deliberately, and you know that sometimes responding quickly is actually essential to getting your profile and your view. That's fine. I understand that. But again, go back to the deliberate thing. That's a plan to do that. For the rest of us, if you're just swept into an event, right, online, over your research, that's when, you might still want to say, well, maybe we should put the brakes on things here, right? And I'm not going to respond to that myself, maybe right away. I'm going to think about it. Maybe I'm going to go talk to an expert at my university or my institute, the communications people, and say, look, this just happened. What should I do? And so-and-so shared this, and now I'm getting requests for interviews about something that doesn't really align with the research itself. Then that's when I think, need to look for outside help. Those are the practical advice that I have been given myself, and I try to follow with my own work. So I hope that helps.
No, that's incredibly helpful, and fantastic advice. I often advise people to, if you find yourself swept up into an echo chamber with several thousand highly motivated people who fight about the same topic all day, every day, you're being just step away from the keyboard for a little while.
Step away.
Yeah.
Just step away from the keyboard.
Yeah.
Back slowly out of the room.
Exactly. You're not likely to do yourself any favors in that circumstance.
Right. Go outside and leave your phone behind.
Exactly.
You remember that common reality that we actually exist in, right? That we talked about at the outset. That is bigger than the rest of us. And thank God, still bigger even than TikTok.
I think that would actually be an excellent point to close on. But before we do that, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're working on right now, or what you've worked on recently and now will be publishing? You've got a book coming out in 2025 on truth and politics.
Right. So one of the things that I've been working on for the last couple of years is the sorts of topics that we're interested in today, but under a sort of wider heading, which is, look, if you think about, let me put it this way, two topics that don't seem to go together. Truth and politics, right? The famous philosopher Hannah Arendt once said, no one's ever really doubted, she said, that truth and politics don't get along, right? They're in a bad relationship. Yeah, that's true. But at the same time, as I said to you earlier in this, in our discussion, it's of vital importance for democracy that citizens who are engaged in democratic politics, real democratic politics, not just performance, that those citizens can pursue what's true over what's false, that they have the means to do so. They have the scientific and historical information that they need to make informed decisions. It's of vital importance, in other words, that we recognize truth to be a democratic value. It's not just, we think of democratic values as things like liberty, right? Equality, fraternity, right? We think of and those are democratic values, central ones. But we don't often recognize, I think, enough that truth is a democratic value too. Because the pursuit of truth, we're not trying to get everybody to believe the same things. That's not likely or even probably possible, right? I mean, we'd like people to believe more truths and falsehoods, but you can't, in a democracy, we're not going to legislate that everybody has to believe the same thing, because that wouldn't be democratic. But what we can do is use the means of democracy to protect and promote reliable means for figuring out what's true. And that means protecting and promoting institutions, in the wide sense of that term, like science, like history, and like public libraries. Again, you might have noticed, under attack in the United States right now. So what this new book is about that riddle. How can truth and politics fit together? And why is it actually essential for democracies to come to an answer to that question? I think that those of us who are engaged in processes like science and history and the other things I've mentioned, educators, and just the ordinary citizen, has perhaps we might even say a duty to try to throw their shoulder behind these institutions that help us pursue the truth. And right now, for reasons we've discussed, those institutions, and therefore the the value of truth and democracy are under attack.
Thank you very much. That's fascinating. And our listeners will find in the show notes a link to pre-order that book. It'll be at that stage.
It is. That would be great.
Excellent. And I appreciate very much your time. I've learned quite a bit today. This has been very valuable for me, and I'm sure as well for our listeners. So thank you.
Thank you.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.